Yeah, my full name is Jackson Pind, kind of like pin tree, pine tree kind of thing. Some people say pine. I actually don't mind that, but it's Jackson Pind is the full name. Yeah, and that is my just English name. I do not have an indigenous name. Able to slowly regain my language. Like I can introduce myself if you'd like to hear it in my language. I can say Ani Bojo Jackson Indigenous Maingan Indodatum, Nagodrowan Indonjaba, Sindam Zaga Ingan Inda, which basically said, "Hi, my name is Jackson. I'm from the Wolf Clan. I originally grew up in Peterborough and I'm now living on Sindam Lake." So I can start slowly doing a little bit of that, and I have some language and a little bit as well to share with you about kind of stars and our cosmological knowledge that I've slowly gained over time as well, working with a lot of these community members. But yeah, I'm a non-status, I'd say mixed Indigenous person that has a lot of community connections to the urban areas of Kingston and trying to reconnect as much as possible as well. I do a lot of community work for my research. I work kind of one-on-one with Curve Lake First Nation, which was another kind of Anishinaabe nation close to Alderville here in southern Ontario. And I've also worked at length with Peguis First Nation as well, which is one of the biggest communities in Manitoba, just north of Winnipeg. So that's where kind of I started developing this two-eyed theory idea about trying to combine it instead of looking at just the sciences to actually apply it to history, because in history we have this massive divide really between the knowledge systems of oral history and written history, and there's really no one trying to connect them together. And that's really what's been my contribution both now with Peguis First Nation and Ray Mason, and also through my dissertation with Curve Lake. That's basically all I've been doing for the last 4 years, just trying to combine these two usually divergent fields and all sometimes hard to talk to each other fields as well, because people don't, you're either an oral historian or you're a written historian, you're not both. So just trying to figure out both of those experiences. And again, that really speaks to me as a mixed Indigenous person, because I understand the value kind of written history and seeing sources and having all this evidence that you can kind of point to. But I also really value and deeply understand oral history and how important it is to really tell the full story of what happened both in residential schools and day schools. So that was kind of a longer answer, but I think it's kind of all connecting back, or at least I'm trying. From my understanding, the term is pronounced Etowapa monk, and that's how the term is used by the Mi'kmaq and was really developed by elders, including Albert Marshall, kind of the main person behind that. And as I've said, I've really approached this from a historical lens rather than a scientific. It has been, or there is currently a lot of studies that have come out really showing the benefits of using this way of thinking towards environmental sciences, really showing that both knowledge systems are valuable, and using both knowledge systems together is actually how we can produce the best results. So the two-eyed seeing kind of word actually refers to seeing with both eyes, whereas one eye refers to the indigenous knowledge, and the other eye refers, I say, to the Western knowledge, but kind of all other knowledge that you kind of want to put beside it. But I think the Western knowledge kind of is a good placeholder if you don't have anything else. And this is where I think you might find it most exciting, is that a lot of ancient indigenous cultures, or cultures around the world for that matter, were some ways connected to the cosmos somehow. And there's lots of different theories about like the pyramids and how they align. But the one theory that I kept running into when looking at the Serpent Mounds and what I wanted to prove, or not prove, I would say, but again, just kind of show that there's a much deeper understanding of the site, was really the summer solstice. So on the summer solstice, it's the longest day of the year, as I'm sure you know. And also, there's a lot of different monuments around the world that kind of line up with this, including the Ohio Serpent Mound. Actually, tens of thousands of people go there every year to watch the sunrise on the summer solstice to kind of mark the changing of the seasons, even today. And other locations too, like Stonehenge, for example, or similar ones where the rising sun kind of aligns with something. So I went to the Serpent Mounds on June 21st at 5:29 a.m. I think it was on 2020, and I visited the site and I got a drone image, or took a drone up to the site and showed that at that morning, the summer solstice, the sun perfectly aligns with the mouth of the serpent, really kind of leading to this belief that the serpent was created obviously for a very particular reason, and also to mark the seasons as a way to kind of track the changes. If you didn't have a calendar, that was probably the best way you could be 100% accurate that this is now the summer season. So that was, I feel like, not a discovery, because again, it was created thousands of years ago by indigenous people, but it hasn't really been taught or really heard amongst the general public. So that's a very exciting story. But again, that kind of philosophy of two-eyed seeing, both seeing the indigenous stories of this place and seeing why they created it, and they're really deep connection to this sacred area alongside the kind of scientific archaeological perspective, because both have value, but we really need to be careful on which ones we kind of trust and lead to. As well, it kind of has deeper questions, and I always talk about this as well. It's just not something that's 2,000 years ago. Right now, as we speak, Rice Lake, where the actual Serpent Mound is located, is kind of in the midst of this massive battle. And you can look up the documentary, it's on CBC. It's called Cottagers and Indians, and really is this fight between cottagers who want kind of clean pathways and indigenous people in that region who want to harvest their wild rice.
The Seven Brothers of the Star Cluster, The Origin of the Pleiades, by Edward Cornplanter, as recorded by Arthur Parker, Seneca Myths and Folktales, University of Nebraska Press, originally published in 1923. Seven brothers had been trained as young warriors. Each day they practiced in front of their mother's lodge, but this did not please the mother. With the boys was an uncle whose custom it was to sit outside the lodge door and drum upon a water drum, that the boys might learn to dance correctly. In time, the boys became perfect in their dancing and then announced that they were about to depart on an expedition to test their skill. The seven assembled about the war post and began their dance. They then went into their mother's lodge and asked her to supply them with dried meat and parched corn for their journey, but she sent them away, scoffing at their presumptions. Again they danced and again returned for food. I will not give you so much as a small cake of cornbread, said the mother, hoping to restrain them, but they went back to their dance. A third time they returned, but again were repulsed. The fourth dance started, and the oldest youth changed his tune to a different song. With great enthusiasm he sang, compelling his brothers to dance a dance of magic. Hearing the weird music, the mother rushed out of the lodge and saw her sons dancing in the air over the trees. This greatly startled her, and she cried, "Return, my sons! What manner of departure is this?" But the song continued, and the boys danced higher and higher. Again the mother cried, "Oh, my eldest son, will you not return?" But the eldest son would not listen, though his heart was touched. Then the mother screamed, "Oh, my eldest son, will you not hear your mother's voice? Only look down to me." Then was the oldest son's heart touched very deeply, but he did not respond for fear of making his brothers weak. "Oh, my brothers," he called, "heed no sounds from the earth, but continue dancing. If you look down, you shall fall and never more be able to dance." The mother now gave a heartbroken cry and called, "Oh, my firstborn son, give your mother one look, one last look, or I die." This weakened the heart of the oldest son, and he looked down toward the figure of his mother with outstretched arms, weeping for him. As he looked, he lost his power to master the air and began to fall. With great rapidity, he fell until he struck the earth and penetrated it, leaving only a scar where the soil came together again. The mother rushed to the spot and swept aside the rubbish, but no trace of her son could she find. Finally, looking up, she saw her other boys dancing far up in the sky. They had become the dancing stars. In deep sorrow, the mother, with covered head, sat beside the spot where her firstborn had fallen. For a whole year she wept as she watched. Winter came, and her dancing boys appeared over the council house, and each night were observed overhead, but no sign of her eldest could be seen. Springtime came, and the time of budding plants. From the spot where the eldest had disappeared, a tiny green shoot appeared. This the mother watched with great solicitude. It grew into a tall tree and became the first pine. This tree was guarded by the melancholy old woman, and she would allow no man to touch it. She knew that if it was her son and would sometimes speak to her. The wind blew and the tree swayed. It began to speak, and the mother heard. Only she could interpret the sounds that came from the waving branches. Only she could see the face of the young warriors with his plumes. A careless hunter slashed at the tree and blood flowed, but the mother bound up the wound and drove other intruders away. In time, the tree bore small, short feathers, cones, and more trees grew. These the hunters slashed in order to get pitch for canoes and ropes. Every winter, the pine tree talked to its dancing brothers in the sky, and the mother knew that her eldest son should be her comfort while she rested on this earth.
The Hunting of the Great Bear, a story by Ray Faden. This is a story that many Ganyigehaga tell their children during the winter moons. Many winters in the past, there was a Ganyigehaga village. One day, hunters discovered the tracks of a giant bear. They saw these tracks many times and noticed that sometimes the tracks would circle the village. Deer, turkey, and other game began to disappear from the forests around them, and the Ganyigehaga knew that the giant bear was killing and carrying off all of the game. Being unable to hunt for food, famine came to the village. The meat racks were empty and the people were hungry and facing starvation. Finally, the head chief said, "We must kill this giant bear who is causing all of our trouble." Hunters and warriors came together to set out in search of the bear. They soon came upon his tracks in the snow, and they followed the bear tracks for many days. Finally, they came upon the huge bear. All at once, the air was filled with arrows, heading towards the bear. To the surprise and dismay of the people, the arrows failed to pierce the thick hide of the bear. Many of their arrows even broke from his tough skin. This attack made the bear angry, and he turned and charged at the hunters, who fled but were soon overtaken. Only 2 of the hunters escaped, and when they returned to the village, they told their people about what had happened. Party after party of warriors set out to destroy the great bear, but always they failed. There were many battles fought between the bear and the people, and many died. As time went on, more and more deer vanished from the forest, leaving the people hungry, sick, and filled with fear. They feared the great bear whose tracks circled their town each night. They feared leaving their village because they could hear, coming from the darkness of the forest, the loud growl of the bear. One night, 3 brothers each had a strange dream. This continued for 3 nights in a row, where they all had the same dream. They dreamt that they had tracked and killed the great bear. They decided that the dream must be true, so they put together a bundle of weapons and food, and they sought out after the bear. In a short time, they came upon the tracks of the bear and followed the trail. For many moons, the brothers followed the tracks of the great bear across the earth. The tracks led them to the end of the world, and looking ahead, they saw the giant bear leap from the earth and into the stars. The 3 hunters continued to chase after the bear, and without hesitation, the 3 of them followed the bear into the night sky. It is said that in the sky, you can still see them chasing the bear during the long winter months. In the fall of each year, when the bear gets ready to sleep for the winter, the 3 hunters are able to get close enough to shoot their arrows at him. His dripping blood, caused by the wounds from the arrows, turn the autumn leaves red and yellow. However, he always manages to escape from the hunters. When the Ganyigehaga see the Big Dipper in the sky, they say, "See, the 3 hunters are still chasing that great bear."
And a lot of these stories or knowledge of the stars are all connected to, again, a local context, a local story, a local indigenous perspective. So I don't want to try to talk all about the Anishinaabe groups, but I'll talk maybe about just 2 or 3 that I think are really interesting and ones I've heard and that feel comfortable talking about. Not particularly their stories, but more of their name and I think their meaning of those constellations. So I think the most famous one and one I was really inspired by once I learned about this was Bagon Gazig. I had to practice a couple times, but it's called Bagon Gazig. That's how you say it's kind of like Bagon, like bug gone, and then Gazig. And that's the interpretation, or at least phrasing I've heard it be called. which means hole in the sky, which is also Pleiades, and commonly referred to in the Maori culture as the Seven Sisters or Matariki. And I learned about that one in a very cool connection with Queens. We have this Matariki program where 7 sister universities all came to Queens, and we talked about kind of our experiences being Indigenous people on this land and giving these other Indigenous cultures kind of a background onto this knowledge. But one of the most interesting facts I found was that every single one of these Indigenous cultures had some story for this cluster of stars in the night sky. For the Anishinaabe, I learned that this story is actually from our origin stories, really where we came down from the sky. And a lot of these other cultures, including the Maori, have a very similar kind of creation story. And I think that kind of blew my mind as well, as I think this constellation is one that can be seen at most times of the year in both the north and southern hemisphere, basically at all times on the horizon, which again kind of connects all of humanity, I say as well, because everyone can see this star, recognize it, kind of understand its meaning, and then obviously offer an interpretation about how it related to their own lives. So that's one of the ones I find really interesting and one I like sharing with people because of that kind of connection that I've experienced through that program. I guess I'll do 2 just really quick other ones. Again, every single constellation has its own story and own really connection, I would say, to an animal, really depending on the seasons as well. And there's a lot of different researchers and stuff going on right now. I've been to a bunch of podcasts and kind of talks like this on Zoom, thankfully, over COVID with people from NASA. There's also this big organization called the nativeskywatchers.org in the United States that also has a lot of information if you're curious. But some other big ones are the Mong, which is the Little Dipper. It's supposed to look like a loon upside down when it's being up in the air. There's also, and maybe just one small thing that I can add here is that the Ojig Unknown, which actually is Polaris, the North Star, actually moves around the Big Dipper there, was connected to it throughout the year. So when really the North Star moves around at different times, that's as well when Indigenous peoples were moving or trying to, again, go into different areas at that time. So that type of story of trying to connect more of these things that were happening in their day-to-day life to both the cosmos and kind of the everyday reality, I think was a huge aspect of their lives. And as I talked about with the Serpent they really were kind of dependent on the seasons and knowing exactly when they would change for both planting their own plants, harvesting medicines, and making sure like when they could actually hunt and fish appropriately, because they understood obviously the processes of reproduction and how animals go through that phases as well. And there's certain times when you can hunt and fish where you won't damage the population, obviously, when the animals are pregnant. So a lot of these stories are kind of baked into the culture, but again, take a lot of time to kind of unravel and piece out. The Ojig, which is the Big Dipper, and again, it's supposed to look like a fisher with an arrow in his tail, which again is another story, but maybe I won't go into that one because again, some of these teachings are only supposed to be told at certain times. And I think that's also kind of one of the beauties of the star knowledge to the Anishinaabe is that they really tell us where we are in time and what we can talk about at that certain time. So Orion's Belt, which is typically above us in the winter here in the Northern Hemisphere, is also known as Nana Bojo or Nana Bush, which is actually a trickster spirit, one of the kind of spirits that gets into a lot of different issues here. But all their kind of collection of stories are actually only supposed to be told in the winter when Orion's Belt is overhead. So again, trying to connect back to these stories, I can't speak to them right now because I think it's actually maybe just on the line of when Orion's going to be in this area. I'm not exactly sure when it leaves this part of northern the hemisphere, but when it's right overhead is when you're supposed to be telling those stories about Nana Bush. And then the last one, which I found very humbling and also important, and I've talked about at length a lot in my classes as well, is that as a mixed Indigenous person who's really reconnecting with my culture, I was thankful enough to go through a sweat lodge ceremony where it's kind of not readopted into the culture, but kind of given a clan as someone that had lost their clan as their family did not know ours. So I was introduced into the Maingan clan, or Maingan Indogena is what it's called in Anishinaabe Moen, and which means a wolf clan. So there's a bunch of different connotations and characteristics of what it's supposed to be like to be in the wolf clan. But one of the most, I would say, inspirational stories, I'd say, is that the wolf is actually not pictured in any of the sky, which at first I was like, okay, that kind of sucks. I wanted to have like my constellation that I could look at kind of thing and show, okay, this is what it looks like. But in reality, the Maingan have a more important role in the constellations. They actually have the Ma'ingan Maikan, which means the wolf trail. And it's actually all of the Milky Way is supposed to signify the wolf's trail through kind of the cosmos. And I think that's a very beautiful story. There's a story as well that the wolves kind of guide spirits along their walk back to the spirit world. And whenever I look up and see the Milky Way, I think of that story. So I really get some good nights when it's clear to see the Milky Way for once, which is, I'm really grateful and appreciative of that again. And I think that again speaks to Indigenous cultures. You know, you have to go out on the land, remote, to actually get some of this knowledge and information. You can't really see it sometimes in the city. You have to kind of return back to the land. So that's a nice way of framing it too.